Hello, welcome to day 2. This is the eye to eye panel, which I'm really excited about. So we're looking at the multiplication of screens as placing intensifying emphasis on images, their production, consumption, and manipulation. So we have 4 speakers. We're going to start with Dalia, then Aarati, Sara, and Verónica. So I'm going to hand you over to Dalia. A quick note that we'll do a Q&A after all the 4 people have spoken today. So if you have your questions, just hang on until the end. And as per usual, this conference is everyone's a stickler for time. So we'll try and make sure that we're finished up by 3:15. So I'll hand you over to Dalia. Cool. Let's get set up here.
Make sure my notes don't fall. So as Louise said, I am Dalia. My full name is Dalia Barghouty. I'm an English PhD student at UC Davis. So I'm here today. I am also up there. And I will be talking about makeup highlighters today. So amidst the post-truth narratives of the 2010s, a cultural obsession with photographic lighting is equally a reaction to falsities as it is a search for actuality. The 2010s, teeming with aesthetics of light, neon, prismatic shimmers, chrome, filters, and glow, in pop culture and on social media feeds, showcase light as abstracting yet simultaneously enhancing what is real. In the beauty community on the internet, this cultural fixation with photographic light and lighting has culminated in what I'm calling here as glow aesthetics, or the rise of makeup highlighters meant to brighten the face and body. So what exactly are highlighters, if you didn't know? They're a powder, liquid, cream, or stick concealing and illuminating cosmetic product used to accentuate areas of your face and body that naturally catch light. Along with contouring, highlighting can also create the perception of depth or angles on the face, leaving every area of the skin it touches luminous and glowing. On her exclusive lifestyle app in 2017 promoting the KKW Beauty Cream Contour and Highlight Kit, media personality Kim Kardashian West noted that the highlighting stick could be used on both the face and the body, giving skin a natural glowing look, especially on camera. On Snapchat, she created and shared multiple snaps detailing a step-by-step process of her using the contour and highlight kit, including showing streaks of contour and highlight on her face prior to blending, which you can see up there. Certainly, the popularity of highlighting and contouring the face seems to be curiously intertwined with one's ability to both pose and post during and after the process. Typically, the sharers of these images are micro-influencers to e-girls to Instagram baddies to the everyday makeup enthusiast and selfie taker on social media platforms. Images of these glow aesthetics range from the naturally dewy to the shimmery to the utmost and at times nearly absurd excess. In some images, even the tip of one's nose is highlighted to appear very noticeably and brazenly glowy. Ultimately, the sheer excess of highlighter in these images turn my page here. So ultimately, the sheer excess of highlighter in these images inspires my fascination with them. Why exactly are we so obsessed with these glow aesthetics? Why are they so ubiquitous? And why have they led to an ostentatious, almost unwearable, in public display of glow? So that was actually a really lazy transition on my part as a writer, because clearly I'm pretty ostentatious myself, so I'm not necessarily questioning that. So while makeup highlighting is a popular contemporary practice, the techniques of highlighting and illuminating the face are certainly not new. I'd argue that highlighting has been a process and technique throughout the history of the mediated image or mediated self. So the term highlight actually was a description of the brightest part of a subject in painting, and that definition first appeared in the 1650s. H. Stanley Redgrove and Gilbert A. Phone's Makeup Manual, Paint, Powder, and Patches, a handbook of makeup for stage and carnival, published in 1930, actually offers us an early account of highlighting as a makeup technique. The following quote is pulled from the chapter Making Up for the Movies in the manual and describes the techniques of highlighting. So I'll read it out loud to you guys. If the face is too broad, a narrower effect can be obtained by highlighting the cheekbones. The makeup artist should first feel the face to discover the exact position of the bones and then apply, a little nearer to the nose than is natural, a lighter flesh tint than the ground color. The highlight must be sufficiently distinct to show through the final powdering, but it must merge imperceptibly into the ground color, or else the camera will reproduce it as a whitish spot surrounded by dirt. This passage offers us an interesting glimpse at a description of highlighting as a makeup technique and process from the early 20th century, one that anticipates the intricate sculpting and shading that Kim Kardashian West undertakes during her own process of highlighting that we saw in the previous slide. It also evidences that the technique of highlighting seems to be dependent on the camera and for the very sake of photography. As Redgrove and Fone suggests, the use of grease paints must look imperceptible to the camera, yet visible enough in that light must reflect from these highlighted areas to produce and achieve a brightness of the skin on screen. So because I'm an English literature student, I'm going to be paying far too much attention to language here. So hopefully it's not too boring, and that's kind of why I have all of these moving images to make it more appealing. So we'll see how this goes. So the word highlight itself is defined in a general sense as an outstanding part of an event or a period of time, or as a bright or reflective area in a picture, painting, or design. In its verb form, highlighter is defined as to draw special attention to or to make visually prominent. It's interesting here because Fone and Redgrove do not define highlight outright, nor do they identify it as a particular practice per se, but rely on the verb itself, highlight, as a way to describe this brightening of the face with grease paint. Beyond this connection that Fone and Redgrove offer us between the makeup technique of highlighting and the screen or camera, I also cannot help but be curious of the fact that highlighting is presented to us in quotes here. Typically, when we place a word between quotation marks, we mean to suggest that we cannot quite nail down a particular meaning, or that particular meaning is aligned with a sense of irony or even a sense of falsity. Quotations are signalers of irony, markers of paradox signaling what a word is but is not. In a way, then, this quoted use of highlight mocks us with the question, can one really exteriorize the self? So, in order to potentially pose an answer, I turn to the work of philosopher Bernard Stiegler, best known in media theory for his theorization of technics. In his book, Technics and Time, Stiegler presents an argument of technics, which I'll boil down here as the idea that technical objects and our human relationship with them constitute time. And I'll attempt to sort of boil down the Stiegler even more in the following couple minutes. So Stiegler begins with an analysis of the verb invent to begin posturing his declaration of technics as constituting the human. So this is a longer quote, but I'll be sort of close reading it, so bear with me. This is my English major coming out again. The invention of the human without or needing to become complacent with the double genitive. Its ambiguity signals a question that breaks down into two. Who or what does the inventing? Who or what is invented? The ambiguity of the subject, and in the same move, the ambiguity of the object of the verb invent translates nothing else but to the very sense of the verb. The relation binding the who and the what is invention. Apparently, the who and the what are named respectively, the human and the technical. Nevertheless, the ambiguity of the genitive, or the invention of the human, imposes at least the following question. What if the who were the technical, and the what the human? Or yet again, must one not proceed down a path beyond or below every difference between a who and a what? So that's the end of that very long quote. But now I'll explain it a little bit. So noticing this inherent ambiguity between the human and the technical, Stiegler locates the birth of technics in the very verb invent itself, while also referring to the deferral of meaning from an unattainable presence that constitutes the relation of and binds this who and the what. Perhaps this paradoxical intertwinement of the who and the what is precisely why Redgrove and Fone, the makeup manual writers, post highlight in quotes. Makeup techniques applied to the face could certainly be considered a form of technics, as Stiegler's techniques are broadly conceived as any object posed in a relation to the human, and in their ambiguity, the very relationality between the human and the object itself. Makeup seems to constitute a grammar or a play of the face, And to highlight the face then poses a curious duality between the physical face and this grammar of the face. Highlighter becomes a particular sort of exteriorization of the face, although I would argue not necessarily a prosthetic one. That is to say that while makeup highlighter can be considered a sort of exteriorization, it is one that is meant to be unpresent or unseen, or going back to that Redgrove and Foam passage, imperceptible, yet simultaneously the most present of all. Through a particular transformational alchemy by means of pigment, liquid, and powder, highlighter enhances what is already there by reflecting light to the face. In its excess of the face, or the body as well, highlighter or highlighter, in quotes, evokes an excessiveness of the presence that binds the very who, and I'm reading that who here as the face or our own selves, and the what or the highlighter product that constitute our own sense of temporality. So ultimately, I'm arguing here that these representations of glow on social media and their very excess and excessivity are aesthetic performances and expressions of our own temporality or sense of presentness as the light of our screens capture us. Building off Stiegler's theorization of technics, digital media theorist Mark B. Hansen's work identifies the very notion of temporality or presentness inherent in Stiegler's theoretical explorations. In Hansen's careful appraisal of Stiegler's philosophy of technics, Hansen builds on notions of the bodily in relation to the present. So for Hansen, this project of presence or presentness is intertwined with the embodied subject and the human's phenomenological experience, which he defines more specifically as embodied temporal fluxes. So basically, ultimately, I'm arguing here that highlighter images, or these glow aesthetics, are an aesthetic performance or expression of these embodied temporal fluxes. And then, viewed collectively, these images make up a network of present temporalities on social media. Get to my last slide. So the last thing I actually want to end on is looking at some makeup products real quick. So, okay. So I'm not going to have too much time to go about this, but basically I've been also looking at how makeup brands sort of employ this language of the present and the real in their products, and then also they have a lot of like in this physical space of the drugstore, a lot of like displays with like actual like iPhones and screens. So yeah, that's also something that I look at. Not only do I look at these images, but I also look at the language in these drugstore displays to sort of think through this idea of like embodied temporal fluxes and glow aesthetics. So yeah, I think if you want to hear more during the Q&A, you can do that. But thank you so much.
First of all, thank you to all the organizers and all of you. I'm really grateful to be here today. Sorry, one moment. My name is Aarati Akkapeddi. I am currently an MFA student at the Design and Technology program at Parsons. My talk today is kind of a reflection on lessons learned through research I was doing for my thesis project. My thesis project is an art installation showcasing a series of experiments done with my own family photographs in relation to a larger archive of South Indian studio photography from the Studies in Tamil Studio Archives and Society. And each of these experiments uses machine learning to sort, categorize, analyze, average the images. I was really interested in both the aesthetic and analytical potential of machine learning to uncover semantic and visual patterns in large image data sets. And with these images in particular, which are so personal, I feel that there's an added layer of meaning in contrasting information gathered by computational means versus information inferred from the familiarity of the images. And so in using machine learning, I was interested in questioning the notion of collective and individual identity, and also highlighting the complexity and multiplicity of the image as a data point. And for my project, I was fortunate enough to work with the Studies in Tamil Studio Archives and Society, abbreviated as STARS. STARS is an interdisciplinary group based in Pondicherry, India, and they have the first ever archive of Tamil commercial studio photography. They've been collecting photos taken in studios in Tamil Nadu that were taken between the 1880s and the 1980s. A lot of my mother is from Chennai, and so a lot of my own family photographs were taken in Tamil studios within this time period. And my interest in using machine learning with these photographs was to kind of start to surface an aesthetic continuity in South Indian photography at this time, and also to explore or even just gesture towards a collective identity around the ways in which we represent ourselves, our families, important events in our lives, such as graduations, marriages, and births. And to find an archive, this larger archive dedicated to this type of image, the family photograph, I feel is really interesting to me because it elevates something that obviously has personal significance to something that also holds this larger cultural significance as well. And so I was looking at similarities in things like pose, composition, props that were used. And so, for example, on the left is an image of my mom when she was a baby, and on the right are images from the STARS archive. And so you can immediately see there's similarities in the flowers, the way that they're posed. But when I started to use the technology, some other interesting questions came up around the image as data. For instance, these tools that I was using, how exactly did they, quote unquote, learn to see? And so I used a lot of pre-trained models like YOLO and OpenPose. YOLO is an object detection model, so you can show it an image and it'll be like, here's a chair, here's a person. And then OpenPose looks at the human pose. And when I say pre-trained and trained, what I mean is, for instance, let's say you have a model that is meant to recognize a chair. You would train it or feed it training data, which might be thousands and thousands of images of chairs. And it can get quite complex, because if you think about it, what is a chair? Is it a stool? Does it have a back? Does it not have a back? And then when I say these were pre-trained, I wasn't doing this work. These models are already trained on images, and I was kind of using these open source tools and applying them to my project, which was really helpful because I didn't have the time or the amount of images I would need to train my own model. However, the images I was working with are quite niche, right? Like they're South Indian studio photography taken between the 1880s and the 1980s. And these models are trained on images that look more like this, usually taken from sites like Flickr or YouTube. And so the images that they were trained on are largely born digital, and I would argue pretty Western-centric. And so I think that caused issues with performance on my very niche data set. So for example, on the right, you have an accordion misidentified as a handbag, and on the middle, you have an elephant misidentified as a dog, and on the right, you have my grandmother's bindi misidentified, or perhaps correctly identified as a third eye. Anyway, these little blips got me thinking a lot about, in general, the consideration for and also visibility of training data sets and machine learning, and how that might better inform like potential bias in the tools that we use. And a lot of research is already being done on this topic. For instance, Joy Bulamwini is a researcher at MIT, a poet of code, and the founder of the Algorithmic Justice League. In her research project, Gender Shades, she looks at products from 3 different companies, IBM, Microsoft, and Face++. And the products are AI-assisted gender recognition tools, so you can show them someone's face, and supposedly they're supposed to be able to recognize the gender. which is kind of problematic in itself. But anyway, through her research, she found that all three companies worked better on male faces than female faces, and all three companies worked better on lighter skin than darker skin. And while more research is needed to pinpoint exactly why there's a gap in accuracy, one really real reason could be the benchmark data sets. So the data sets used in testing the accuracy of the product during the production phase are by and large very white and male. And other researchers have talked about the kind of pale maleness of data sets. For instance, Kate Crawford, who is the co-founder of AI Now at NYU, in her talk titled The Trouble with Bias, she specifically talks about this really popular face data set called Labeled Faces in the Wild. It's around 13,000 images of people's faces taken from the news. And in her talk, she points out that around 77.5% of these images are of men, and 83.5% of them are white, and around 530 of the images are of George W. Bush, so that's around 4%. George W. Bush. And kind of taking it back to photography, I think that these issues really remind me a lot of Shirley cards. And Shirley cards are used in calibrating color for film photography, and so they're called Shirley after the first model who was used in this, who was an employee at Kodak. But what's interesting about Shirley cards is prior to the 90s, they're mostly of white women, and so this meant that film photography was calibrated to work best with white skin. And so you have people with darker skin showing up as either underexposed or overexposed. And this issue also carries into the digital realm as well. One other Shirley is Lena Soderbergh. She's a Playboy model, and her 1977 centerfold has become commonplace in imaging research. So you can find her image a lot in like JPEG compression papers. Her image was even one of the first images to be uploaded to the internet. And Jeff Seidemann, who was the president of the Society for Imaging Science and Technology at the time of this quote, which is around 2012, he stated that when you use an image like that for so long, it's not a person anymore, it's just pixels. And I find that quote quite problematic because I don't think that people are pixels. I think that the images we use really affect who gets to be seen and how they get to be seen. And thinking back to the topic of my thesis, looking at Indian photography, this point is quite poignant to me because photography in India prior to the time period within which the STARS archive was looking at, a lot of the earliest uses of photography there were during the British Raj for ethnographic research. And there you literally have the subject being viewed as a specimen to be studied. So images are labeled according to caste, religion, region. And so, but now I want to talk about takeaways. So how I've synthesized these observations into tangible guidelines that I'm trying to apply to my practice as both an artist and a programmer. So number one, mapping models back to the training data set, that essentially trying to look at how they learn to see and what they learn to see. So for instance, here I have the start of a map looking at some of the tools I used in my thesis. And so I'm looking at what institutions were involved in the making of this tool. So for instance, Google, or what educational institutions like NYU. And then, of course, what images were they trained on? So are they coming from Flickr or YouTube? What might they look like? And I think that this exercise just helps in trying to identify potential bias in the tools that we use. And number two, pretty simple, but I think pretty powerful, make conscious decisions about the images used in research papers and projects. So just being aware of the impact of even like test images you're using in your work. So thinking back to Lena, the use of her image in research papers kind of goes beyond the topic of the paper itself, but it kind of sends a message about the gendered workplace and field of study. Number three, build a more diverse corpora of data sets. With this one, I'll add the caveat of being aware of how those data sets might be used and also where that data is coming from. So for example, IBM, which was one of the companies in the Gender Shades research project, they recently came out with something called Diversity in Faces, which was trying to address that gap actually, but by creating a data set that had more diverse faces in it, but they got a lot of pushback because they sourced these images with from Flickr, and people didn't really give permission for their faces to be used, and their faces were labeled with things like skin tone and facial geometry. So being aware of that. And then finally, the barometer of accuracy should take into account the potential diversity of users. So during the testing phase of a product or technology you're working on, you should take into account the full breadth of the users instead of kind of limiting your scope to yourself or your internal team. And yeah, thank you. I hope that this talk could give a little insight on how to have a deeper consideration for the relationship between images, representation, and technology.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sara Reinis. You'll see a slight tweak in my presentation title here versus the program, because I finally zeroed in on the term I wanted to use. So I'll be talking about a phenomenon that I'm calling manufactured recollection, which is a reflection on the increasing involvement of algorithms in our memory-making practices. So as all of you know, we've entered into an era of constant and incessant photo taking. We're no longer restricted by film or technical equipment or storage limitations, so our image-making practices are uninhibited. Estimates currently suggest that well over 1 trillion photos are being taken annually, which leads to us having overflowing archives of our lives that are bursting at the seams. So it becomes near impossible for individuals to meaningfully sort through their own photo libraries manually. This then creates a dependence on algorithms to sort through this content. So from social media news feeds to AI-created albums in our personal digital photo libraries, algorithms have become the curatorial assistants that are guiding us through these massive archives that we've created of ourselves. To the right, you'll see Google Photos ad copy, and you'll see how algorithms are promising to offer some sort of respite or a sense of control over the success of content. So the copy here promises to automatically organize by what quote unquote matters. So one of the ways that photo services are promising to help us achieve a sense of meaning in the midst of our massive photo swamps is through introducing various memories features. So across social media, I'm focusing specifically on Facebook and Instagram and personal photo libraries such as Apple Photos and Google Photos. Algorithmically generated memories features are becoming widespread and standardized. These memories features automatically create slideshows of our friends using facial recognition and ask us to revisit photos that we've taken on this day years prior. As a result of these features, algorithms increasingly determine the content and the cadence of our memories, a phenomenon that I'm calling manufactured recollection. Memory making is essentially becoming a more collaborative process that fuses together the interests of social media platforms, advertisers, and technology manufacturers. I think it's also important to note specifically how important photography is to our subjectivities and our self-understanding. Algorithms increasingly control how and when we interact with our photographs, giving them a deeply emotional inroad to our identity-forming practices. As camera technology has become more accessible and social media use spreads rapidly, photography has become linked not only to self-documentation, but to the treasured modern social value of self-expression. So as a result, we view photographs as prosthetic extensions of our true selves in our interior lives. The undeniably powerful influence of photography over our self-understanding really demands that we pay a lot more attention to the forces and the technology that are impacting how we process and understand these images, namely algorithms. So let's take a look at the common algorithm-driven memories features that are becoming a central way of how we interact with our photos. For the purposes of my discussion, I'll be shifting through photo-oriented platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Google Photos, and Apple Photos, and the different memories features that they offer. Though not all these features are exactly the same across these platforms, they do function together to form a fairly uniform landscape of manufactured recollection that essentially underpins at least the digital lives of nearly everyone who has a social media profile or a smartphone. Starting with On This Day, probably the most self-explanatory feature and also the most consistent one. Every single one of the platforms that I mentioned has a version of this feature. Arguably, this was originally popularized by the standalone app TimeHop, but now this feature is widespread across all platforms and resurfaces a post or a photo on the anniversary of that post. I think most interestingly is the fact that this feature is establishing a regular cadence of induced nostalgia on a mass scale. So across all of these platforms, you're seeing this feature widely adopted, which is establishing and normalizing this new inflection point in our process of remembrance. We also have highlight reels or cinematic videos developed by AI that thread together a narrative. They automatically assess this idea of importance, overlaying music, titles, animated transitions, and more, inviting us essentially to become audiences of ourselves and sit back and watch this pre-established algorithmically generated slideshow. So the product manager for Google Photos specifically stated that the purpose of these movies is to leverage AI to make movies that are emotionally powerful, that make you really smile or even make you cry and reminisce and show your family. So to the right, you'll see screenshots from my Apple Photos and Google Photos. As you'll see with Google Photos, you can use AI to trigger a Valentine's Day movie, bottom right. So you can tag your significant other. They'll piece together this cinematic slideshow that has a culmination point that uses acoustic guitar swelling underneath it. You can also notify the algorithm if someone in your camera roll has passed away, and they'll create an in memoriam slideshow, the in loving memory on the top left of the screenshot. Then you'll see my large face on Apple Photos behind where they've superimposed a big day and May 2017. So the algorithms realizing that I had a lot of photos on this day, a lot of them group photos, a lot of them smiling, determined that it was a big day. They didn't know exactly what kind of big day, but they pieced together, a ceremonious movie about this event. It was a big day. It was the day that I finished my master's program. They just didn't quite know exactly what, but I guess they were right. And then below, you'll see On This Day as well. That's just a meme of Beyonce. So sometimes they don't exactly, well, no, I do want to remember that. So that's important as well. Also notably, all of these memories features are often paired with this prompt to share. So nearly all of these memory features are accompanied by a push to then send out these memories, which ties the act of remembrance to the act of creating and circulating more content on these platforms. So for example, on Instagram, if you get an On This Day feature telling you about a photo from 2 years ago, if you click that notification, it pre-assembles a pre-packaged story for you to send out, which you'll see on the right side there with the subtitle memories, the date there, and ready to send off. So everything is kind of linked together under this idea of remembering, but then recreating that moment in the present. Jonathan Geller, Facebook product manager over these features, specifically said that consuming memories from the past and resharing them rewires our relationships. So this rewiring of relationships via the app is the end goal that these products were engineered with. It's also important to note that the act of remembrance and the practice of photography has, of course, always been oriented towards social sharing, but there is something notably different, I believe, about automated suggestions that push toward the constant circulation in the public sphere and specifically keep you in this cycle of these platforms. And last but certainly not least, good old success metrics. This one is most salient on Facebook, but I believe it's going to be adopted by Instagram shortly and other platforms as well. And it regularly serves up your photos that receive the most likes and comments. So to the right is a post that Facebook surfaced to me this past week showing my most commented on photo in 2015. Showing me with animated figurines and little bubbles, all the nice things that people said about my sister, my mom, and I. And Mom, you're probably watching, so thank you for being a reliably good performance marker in my personal brand. I appreciate that. So these success metrics introduce audience engagement as a key factor in what is elusively worth remembering. They attempt to quantify what is best and what is most meaningful based on how it's performed and based on how audiences are perceiving it. And then they also ask us to remember that these things were successful and therefore continue to influence us, not just in the moment of receiving the notification when we first post, but later on checking in with us about what is doing well on these platforms. So essentially, our personal narratives are increasingly co-authored by these algorithms because they're becoming more deeply intertwined with our personal photos. Algorithms are dictating when to reminisce and also what to reminisce about. So in doing so, they're creating more feedback loops that influence our memories. Due to the mass adoption of social media and digital photo libraries, the values that are encoded in these algorithms are affecting how society forms memories and forms their identities on an unprecedented scale. We currently have hundreds of millions of people who are building and exploring their memories and therefore their personal identities on the exact same algorithmic foundation. And this deserves more scrutiny. In all, manufactured recollection is infusing a commercial logic into our self-understanding. We see this through how it's prioritizing audience engagement and success metrics, which brings a market logic into our feedback loop, making us keenly aware of the impressions and the engagements that our own posts get to encourage more successful posting in the future. Essentially, these features with success metrics and these ways that they attempt to quantify what is best are asking us to adapt, adjust, and optimize according to the market research that algorithms are constantly doing on behalf of our personal brands. We're also seeing the increased intimacy and codependency on platforms, and that reminds us of an important thing, which is that these platforms at the core are commercial enterprises that have a vested interest in increasing our activity on them and our codependency with them. The important question with that is, with this dependency, what do you do when you want to withdraw from a platform? So take, for example, the Facebook controversy. There's not a single one, I guess, but the big one last year and all the continued iterations of the Facebook controversy. A lot of people wanted to divest and deactivate, but how do you do that when these programs and platforms become fully intertwined with our understanding of who we are? We're also seeing the incentivization of continual production of personal content, which is, of course, of interest to commercial platforms as our externalized memories are monetizable, and they're not monetizable when they're still in our interior state. So through resurfacing moments from our past, these push notifications and these slideshows ask us to recollect, and they further enforce actually a hyperactive and hyperproductive present. So sort of collapsing the time of taking these past moments, turning them into ever-present content. This then leads to the continual production of ourselves and the continual production of content and the production of ourselves through photography on these algorithm-supported features. So these algorithm-supported memory features ostensibly help us sift through the mire of our excessive photos, but actually pull us deeper into the cycle of continual and constant production. We also see, finally, the packaging of memories into a standardized and legible system of importance. These slideshows and anniversaries of photographs superimpose a well-packaged, uniform narrative onto our life stories, creating a standardized scaffolding of identity formation across the lives of millions. Questions about what memories are encouraged then become really important here. Studies have demonstrated the concept of retrieval-induced forgetting, which is the process by which repeatedly visiting certain target information causes the forgetting of non-target information. So we then must ask ourselves what memories are left on the outskirts of the algorithms, and what does it mean for our subjectivities at large that we are all operating from the same system?
Hi, my name is Verónica Uribe. I am a second-year PhD student at UC San Diego in Communications and Science Studies, and I'm going to present a case study, I guess, that I did back in my country, Peru. Okay, so like many other nation brands across the global south, Marca Peru, Peruvian nation brand since 2011, it's a joint effort from the state and the business guild to use the country's cultural resources to foster foreign investment and tourism. In resonance with other emerging entrepreneurial neoliberal forms of enacting citizenship throughout the global south, the Peruvian experience shows how effective these placemaking strategies are, at least domestically, when successfully linked to nationalist and entrepreneurial discourses. Over the past 8 years, Peruvians have come to identify with the brand goals and logo, assuming them as part of a new and multicultural national identity project. Peruvians eagerly engage in these campaign celebratory practices, for instance, by including the logo in products, business facades, and cultural events. Furthermore, they determine the value of others and their own cultural activities and civic partakings in relation to the brand's international market-oriented indicators. Throughout its year of tenure, Marca Peru's virtual platform have encouraged and relied on those citizens' voluntary, emotional, and yet often opportunistic engagement with the logo. These platforms ensure participation through formal and informal channels, official contests and licenses, as well as unregulated user-generated content, such as appropriations and reproductions of the logo in and outside the web. However, not all interventions are welcome. Those appropriations of the logo that sought to enact citizenship through critique were faced with copyright law infringements and censorship. This presentation explored the visual economy generated by these last type of appropriations on the web through the case of Álvaro Portales, artists whose intervention to the logo were censored by Peru government entity charged with Marca Peru in 2014. First, I want to very briefly explain how nation brand user-generated content operates. In a logo, The Power of Brands, Naomi Klein highlights the misleading trap that many companies use when trying to make their brand part of popular culture, while maintaining total control over the cultural and historical legacy. It is a process, she said, that ultimately muzzles cultural criticism since it uses copyright laws as effective instruments to silence all unwanted discourse. Marca Peru works in a similar way to the clear and open intention to turn this logo a national icon, opposes strict parameters for its use, since in this case we're dealing with a relationship between the state and its citizens. By promoting and regulating its logo appropriations, Marca Peru also promotes and regulates forms of citizenships and political participation. All these based on the brand's international market-oriented indicators. Now, I want to focus on the logo interventions, the referential and performative function. The vignettes in the slide by artists Jesus Cosillo and Rafael Mendoza help me exemplify the referential function of these subversive interventions. Both artists depicted members of Andean indigenous communities, a population historically excluded from state projects, who the audience can see, but who seem invisible to other characters in the vignette. In the presence of those previously absent, the effort of the campaign are revealed as ridiculous and even cruel. Ridiculous because, as Mendoza said about his work, the vignette shows a more than obvious reality: the state abandonment of its most vulnerable population, and cruel because it is precisely this population, the one that has contributed the most to those elements that the campaign seeks to explode. In the case of Álvaro Portales, we have 4 series of images where the logo has the leading role. The last 3 series reference a specific social conflict that led to clashes between the state and citizens. According to the 3 artists, their intervention to the logo seek to modify it to truly represent Peru. Along with this referential function, images have a performative function. They are also an instrument to mold behavior, to organize action, and intervening in the world. They constitute reality. For example, Marca Peru's images do not only seek to represent, but to organize their citizens, make them multicultural, which means diverse, yet homogeneous, and devoid of conflict. In the same way, artists like Portales not only seek to unmask this branded country, but to intervene and organize its production and subvert it. That is, to fulfill the brand request or dictate or mandate of living the brand, but in their own way. How does this reorganization happen? In clear reference to pre-Inca cultures, Marca Peru logo seeks to link Peru's past with a modern version of the country. However, the open code provided by its image quality makes the logo a platform for new meanings, uses, and appropriations. As these artists make use of the open code of the image and take advantage of its non-narrative quality, they also reveal visual regimes and models of subaltern citizenship. Now, to the visual economy per se. According to Deborah Poole, visual economy comprises 3 levels of organization. The first one consists of an organization of production that includes both individuals and technologies that produce images. I want to stop at this level because I don't have enough time. We can discuss it later. A second level of this visual economy focuses on image circulation, internet production, and distribution network has an important role here. More than unilateral transmissions like broadcasting, the distribution infrastructure of the internet, a point-to-point network, promotes reciprocal interactions. This virtual support is key to explain the performative function of these images, as well as the speed in which these images circulated and circulate until today. The third level of organization, also linked to circulation, implies an economy of vision, different to visual economy, understood as the cultural and discursive system through which graphic images are appreciated, interpreted, and assigned value, historical, scientific, and aesthetic, explains Poole. In the case at hand, we find discourses that celebrate these appropriations and those that censor those images. My article, like this presentation, focuses on this last speech, the censor wants to analyze how the figure of this unpatriotic citizen emerges from the values granted to the logo and to Portales' intervention. Judith Butler argues that censorship not only limits the discourse of those it regulates, but also establishes norms through which subjects are produced. Hence, this rule determines which subjects and which discourses are admissible as publics and which are not. Therefore, censorship as images has a type of formative or constitutive power. However, his work is never complete. Censorship produces new meanings because in order to exercise it, one first needs to name what is condemned. You need to show it. And this was exactly what happened with the images of Portales on the web. On May of 2014, the artist received a message from Prompt Peru in his Facebook account. You can see it here. In this, he was asked to remove from his blog his third series entitled Marca Peru Mata Peru, which means Peru brand, Peru kill. The reason, the images generated confusion among internet users and do not correspond to the correct and effective use of the brand. Portales publicly refused to withdraw the series, considering he has the right to express his opinion. This episode concluded 2 days later with a public statement from the Peru brand manager department apologizing and reiterating its respect for the rights of freedoms of expression. So, from Peru Peru's attempt to build consensus through censorship ended up producing one of those paradoxical consequences Butler mentioned. Portales' public response to support and coverage he received from virtual media, in addition to similar reactions from other censored citizens during the same dates, granted the images a political value beyond its aesthetic value. In this way, thanks to the censorship, the value of the logo or brand, which the campaign wanted to avoid to discuss, was publicly discussed online. Among the several comments posted regarding this debate, we find those celebrating the images of Portales for better representing our reality. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the censorship of the peers that I'm going to go to now to finish. In this second censorship, there is an assessment of the images and of the citizen, Álvaro Portales, from their fellow citizens. The images are considered crap, but also good and original. They make people laugh, but only misfits. Finally, they are perceived as lucrative. Portales, on the other hand, is described as someone that resents society, who doesn't value his country, does not see the positive, and enjoys criticizing Peru. In addition, he belongs to that kind of citizen, the reason for Peru's underdevelopment. The comments also revealed that for some, this logo has the status of national symbol, and therefore Portales' interventions are anti-patriotic. Moreover, the goals of the brand are identified with those of the nation. The critique of the way in which the artist is benefiting economically from the logo is interesting, since it tells us that although lucrative by not following the celebratory models of entrepreneurship, it is unwelcome. Finally, and this is how I end, I'm sorry. Finally, we find the qualifier Andean or Andean emo. A key to understand the presence of the term Andean in the construction of the anti-patriotic citizens can be traced back to Peru post-independent national identity project. Peruvian historian Cecilia Melendez analyzes the racist discourse deployed by a group of Creole Peruvians who opposed the Peru-Bolivian Confederation project that Marshal Andrés de Santa Cruz tried to carry out between the years 1836 and 1839. So just to finish it before I already ran out of time. So this racist form of crafting the Peruvian identity comes back with these new ways of crafting this nation that is modern, but also kind of like keeps remembering its past. But we can discuss this later.
Thank you to all of our speakers. They were fascinating presentations. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. If you have a question, if you'd like to raise your hand, and I will come to you with the fabulous wireless microphone. Does anybody have one to get started? No? Yeah.
Oh. Hey, I have a question for Sara. I was wondering if you could speak about how kind of Instagram and Facebook's adaptation of kind of like Snapchat-like features with these like short, like 15-second clips are kind of also altering the ways that we make memories and kind of share what we're doing on a daily basis.
Oh, I can lean really far.
Sorry. Oh, that's okay.
Okay.
It's also loud.
Here we go.
Yes.
I think one thing that's really interesting about all these platforms is the way that something can start off as like a unique bespoke feature that's characteristic to a certain platform, and then if it's successful, it gets like mass adoption everywhere else. So we are seeing Facebook now has stories, Instagram now has stories. I think that, again, that's another mode in which there's the continual content production that becomes like an imperative to always stay relevant and to stay on top of the algorithm and to stay visible. You must be constantly producing. And then I think that works in partnership with these memory features, because it's like, oh, if you didn't do something notable today, maybe you did 3 years ago today. So surface that back up again on your stories again. And I think it's interesting that Snapchat started off more as these ephemeral 24-hour only stories, and then Facebook and Instagram, which have adopted them, have also introduced then archives and the ability to resurface ones you've already taken. So you kind of see this like ever continual productive present working in combination with this like constant call for nostalgia. And I think they seem like they're asking for different things, but I think they're both like collapsing us into this like hyper productive content production at all times. Yeah.
Hey, I thought it was really interesting how Aarati's presentation was kind of talking about algorithms and their impact on like the history of photography and that kind of like creating memories in that way. And then Sarah's is talking about more about like how that is affecting us now. I kind of just would want to hear like what you both think, how each other's presentation relates.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah. I was like really glad that yours went before mine, because mine's like algorithms, those exist. I know that. Here's how I think they're affecting us. Whereas yours was like such a thoughtful interaction with also the ethical questions and like the identity intersection that comes with how these algorithms actually work. And I think yours did like this fantastic job of like my loose open-ended questions at the end of like what things exist on the outskirts of algorithms. Like I think you did a beautiful job critically assessing kind of those questions that I left very open.
When I was listening to your presentation, it actually made me think a lot about kind of thinking about the comparison between memory making now versus like back in the day going to a studio, like a photography studio, and like only on during certain occasions. And especially because for me, the time hop feature is usually like, oh, 3 years ago today, here's a picture of your cat next to a pile of laundry. It's like very mundane. So yeah, that made me think about like how many images we produce now, and also I don't want to say like lack of consideration, but like is it different because it's easier in a way to like make more images? And how does that affect I guess our personal archiving process? But yeah. I'll just hold on to this.
Hi, another question for Sarah. I was wondering if you had any thoughts around the way in which, so I guess a lot of the stuff around this, you talked about, is about this sort of delegation of memory off to another service who's sort of remembering on behalf of us. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how that kind of interacts with kind of agency and consent, because there's a lot of the kind of problems with stuff like time hop that's mentioned is people being reminded of kind of quite viscerally upsetting things that have happened in the past, or things that they would rather not remember. And do you have any thoughts about that, and about how perhaps how this sort of idea of our control over what we remember is being kind of given up?
I do have thoughts. I had to cut it out of my presentation. So yeah, I think, whoa, I did get really loud. I think one of the big things, there's also been a lot of interesting research done about how, for example, even if you're thinking about our memory of like trivia, how the introduction of like a Google search engine offloads that responsibility from us and then creates more dependency. I think it's interesting that we're starting to offload that with our personal memories as well. I know myself, I'm like, well, I can take 20 pictures of this thing because the algorithm will later tell me what's important. Like it'll come back up eventually. I'll sort it out. I don't have to worry about this anymore. And I think what's also interesting in terms of how the algorithms are being created is they're trying to respond to this idea of what is sensitive and what's being brought up. So Facebook, because it also owns not only your photos, but also your interactions, if you've listed a relationship and then unlisted a relationship, it will try to take that person out of your memories that get resurfaced to you. Also, Facebook creates, when someone's passed away, an in memoriam profile. and that will also change then if they're tagged in that photo. So it's almost like you can control more if you give them more data. So if you let them know that you were in fact in a relationship and then it ended, or this person was important to you and then passed away, then they can protect you from it. But almost if you send off all the photos without adding on that layer of the data, then you're actually more at the mercy of it. So it's kind of this interesting thing of, if you offload more of your agency by giving more of the data, then you get more of the results that you want.
Hi. So I really appreciated how we talked about a lot of ways that like images are a way of like expression of like our prosthetic self or like our external self, but also how they're controlled or manipulated by like state governments or like social media markets, all of this kind of stuff. What would that kind of self-expression through image look like without the relation to like an institution like that? Or like, would there be more positive ways of like self-expression through the image that you can think of? This is for like anybody, I guess.
Is this just for like everyone or for, okay. So I actually wasn't really able to get to my sort of conclusory paragraph that was kind of like, but capitalism, man, womp womp, you know, like, and because I definitely was thinking about that, you know, at least for my project, like there's sort of this idea of like, you know, these images sort of evoking sort of this sense of presentness. However, I was going to kind of get into it looking at some of the sort of marketing language that retailers use, but there is this sense that one can't really, you know, get away from sort of the tendrils of capitalist semiotics, right? So yeah, I'm still trying to figure that out personally for my project. I personally, as someone who wears makeup, I like to think of it as sort of a creative exercise. However, it's pretty clear that, like I said, it's not really sort of escaping the grasp of capitalism. So I'm actually working through that in my own project. Does anybody else want to speak to this?
Sorry. I guess in the case of my research, there is always kind of like ways of manipulating these images that circulate. What I will be more kind of like in ways that represent us. I guess in this intervention, these citizens were trying to show their concern and their civic partake in their political intervention. I do feel that this clash between the space that kind of like see us or where we act as citizens and the space that we act as consumers is complicated and need to be further kind of like discussed, because copyrights exist for one reason, but they can clearly be used for different other ones. Yeah.
We have time for, I think, maybe 2 more questions. If anybody on the other side of the room has a question, can get the microphone to you. No? Yeah. Otherwise, it's just my 15,000 questions that I have.
Hi, loved them all. I'm just talking, ask a question maybe for Sarah, or whoever else wants to talk about it. Yeah, it just seems like everything's coming back to this like heightened capitalism of like everything's a market now, even taking photos and sharing photos, like everything is a competition, everything is a market. Do you think people using these features sense these kind of things? I guess this is kind of a part of everyone's discussion, like do people understand what is happening here in these like spaces when they use them?
Quick answer, I think passively, especially in terms of this tacit awareness of what performs well or not. Like, I think it's impossible to not know that, because every time that you're uploading something, at least with social media, you're getting quantified feedback about what is worth sharing, therefore what's worth remembering. So I think, yeah, even people who don't actively engage with those thoughts, I think start thinking, what kind of photo does perform well? What is more memorable? And then I guess this is the question I always ask myself, is like, I know all these things, but I'm still posting everything. So, but that's more self-condemnation than anything, that I think that there are people who are thinking about it and critically assessing it, but it is hard to figure out what is the other way to interact with these systems. I don't have the answer for that, right? Because even if you try to say, I'm going to do something again outside of the system, then you're still doing it under the shadow of that system in that process as well. So I guess that's my answer.
Is there any other questions? Oh, super. Getting in my exercise.
So this one is, again, Sarah. I'm relatively speaking, by the modern age, digital hermit. Like, I take photos and I share them in a very like concerted effort or in a concerted way with people that matter to me. I feel to some extent that over time, am I like falling behind in society because all of these things are actually doing a more active, better job? But on the other hand, I feel like what I'm doing is something that matters more to me and it shows more that I care in that way. So over time, what does that kind of relationship look like, I guess?
Like, what will happen if you continue being a digital hermit?
Yeah. And it's like relatively.
Yeah, I think that's like an interesting question, right? Of like how much you choose to participate in these or not and what the eventual impact of that is. I think that's why it's also important to realize that everyone has really, as much as there's standardization of what these systems and algorithms look like, there's very different interaction points that people have. For example, if your camera roll is full of memes, then what you're being resurfaced is like those things as well. So I guess I wouldn't say that I don't think anyone can be like left behind, whereas maybe you're, operating with certain artifacts of your memories in different ways than other people are. But I don't think that the changes that are happening with these memory making algorithms are so much like shifting what it means to be human, or that they are like net new in some absolutely colossal way. I think it's like small shifts towards something. So I guess to soothe the fear, I think if you're a digital hermit, you're not being left behind. probably good in some ways. But yeah, I think everyone kind of like sorts out what process. I think everyone also should be really conscious of like what is sustainable, like what type of digital activity is sustainable for any given person is like important question for individuals to ask themselves. Because I think I don't think that you can prescribe that for all people. I think it depends on different people.
Anybody else have a question? Okay. I'm really hoping I'll get to ask my question.
Hey. Love that. Yeah, so I feel like now that we're all kind of like advertising ourselves and sort of like constantly managing the production of our own images, it feels like the slightly differentiating mode of cultural production is curation. And so now like there's fewer people on Instagram that are doing curation than are doing image production, but that's kind of a little bit of a thing too. I'm thinking of like people that reproduce stories, or even like Instagram's trying to get in on this with like the explore behavior. So they're trying to sort of co-opt the gesture of curation and sign management. Anyway, I just wondered if any of you had any responses to the ethics of curation.
So I think that in a lot of ways, all of our projects up here can kind of sort of inform that. I think that Sarah's sort of idea of the hyper-productive like presence, and sort of what I was getting at in my own project of this idea of sort of presentness and embodied temporal fluxes is really I would argue what we're kind of seeing Instagram and other platforms like move towards. So like thinking more about an instant rather than like sort of like a curated kind of image, or just curating these static images is sort of curation, right? But then you're moving to sort of like moving images perhaps, which is kind of why I used more moving images in my presentation to sort of evoke that idea that we're trying to sort of get, or platforms are sort of trying to sort of get at that singularity. Yeah.
I feel in a way we all curate the images we post. We don't post everything, and we sure discard a lot of selfies. And even the frame itself is a way of framing something, like kind of like directing the attention towards something. So I think that would be my comment.
Before we wrap up, Verónica, I was just thinking during your presentation towards the end, looking at the comments that are left on the screen, and I apologize because I may have missed you say it in the presentation, where the comments are from.
Our fellow citizens who are ranting about the artist, kind of like.
Is there a particular platform?
No, they're just, yeah.
I'm just thinking because last night we heard in the keynote, Dana Boyd was talking about a kind of repetition of a drive for publicness for certain internet users and then a retreat back to privacy. I'm just wondering, in terms of your research, has that fluctuation between a desire for privacy in private communities or more public, outspoken critiques of political structures, government structures, is that something you've come across at all?
Well, so I think the state kind of like rather not have this kind of interaction around the logo, and I guess citizens themselves that I'm using the logo to profit would rather to keep the logo as happy, shiny people. I don't know. I don't see in the. Yeah, that would be my answer.
Fair enough. Anybody one last question before we wrap up? Yes.
For the presentation about, sorry, I'm blanking on your name now, your family's photos, it was making me think about people giving away like their genetic material to know about their family. And I was imagining this like future database of family art photos with machine learning and like this collapse of like one specific person's family photos eventually like becoming a more collective thing, and the issues around privacy and like about it becomes pixels rather than a person. I don't like those kinds of topics about our history becoming owned by technology.
Yeah, I think well, in my thesis, I was kind of trying to play with that a little bit because I think it was kind of like weird to see a picture of my mom and then see like hundreds of photos that look very similar. But I also think it's kind of cool in a way. But I think it's interesting to thinking about the archive that I was working with, and it kind of doing research with them kind of opened up a lot of interesting aspects about like the archiving world, which I'm not from and I don't know that much about, but thinking about, so for instance, they're digitizing hundreds of images and thinking about like who gets access to them and how they're accessed. In this case, I think they are working with the British Library, but yeah, I think it's really important. Privacy is like a huge issue. And while I think it's really cool to have an archive like this available, I think they definitely put a lot of thought into like how it's available. For me to use it, I contacted them and like built a relationship, I guess, there. But.
Okay, we are officially out of time, but thank you for your really interesting questions, and I think a round of applause again for all of our presenters. It was really great.